edge of death, my heart races. I am alive.
Serve me whether you like it or not. I'm not going anywhere.
This league, Steel Champ got a pretty massive facelift from Vengeant Cascade. Now, in the off chance that you don't know what this is, Vengeant Cascade causes all attack projectiles to return from their final destination and pierce all targets on the way back. With the new way that projectiles function with returns this league, Splitting Steel is now a powerhouse single target skill on top of being excellent clear. The reason for this is that Splitting Steel is actually an AoE ability. When these projectiles reach their final destination, they explode in an area of effect damage portion. And because of this, with all of the projectiles returning to our character, they now can overlap, meaning we can get upwards of 1500% damage effectiveness, if not more, on some bigger targets. Now, one of the massive strengths of this build this league is that with Vengeant Cascade carrying our single target damage, we're able to progress extremely smoothly. We can start with leveling up and farming some Alkan Go maps into like tier 16s with a relatively juicy Atlas tree, and all of this is on a super low budget with a 1 Chaos Sword. This allows us to make enough currency to be able to upgrade the build all the way to the point that we can farm juiced delirium maps, which is what you're seeing in the background, to make some very serious currency. Now, I'll make a video talking specifically about this currency strategy later, but this currency can be spent on another build because I feel that this build is most effective at its midpoint. However, if you do want to seriously invest, you can go all the way and be able to farm a very large portion of the Ubers comfortably. Now, talking about Splitting Steel in particular, this is an Impale build that utilizes a 2-button rotation of attack enemies with Splitting Steel, applying Impales, and then ripping those Impales out of the enemy, causing a massive overlapping AoE with Call of Steel. Splitting Steel has a single projectile that once it hits an enemy, or when it reaches the end of its trajectory, will split into numerous additional projectiles. These projectiles go in various directions, dealing damage to all enemies that they hit. However, now thanks to Vengeant Cascade, those projectiles will also return to us at the end of their travel and explode directly in front of our character. This allows for some massive overlaps and damage that cause our single target to absolutely skyrocket. For clear, we utilize either Pierce or Fork to facilitate better coverage in very dense packs, as the projectiles will pierce all targets on their return to us thanks to Vengeant Cascade. Now, Call of Steel is also an extremely strong ability as well, and I feel that this ability gets a very bad rap as a reload type ability, because when you're using Splitting Steel, you have these steel charges that have to be reloaded with Call of Steel. However, when clearing, and especially in very dense delirium maps, Call of Steel is one of the best damage abilities in the game effectiveness wise, because it completely ignores any damage mitigation that the enemies have. It takes all of that impale damage you dealt previously and explodes it in a huge AoE around the target, causing massive cascades of damage that ignores defenses completely. Talking about impale, it can be a slightly confusing mechanic for some people. However, the way that impale works is that it takes 10% of the physical damage that you would do with a hit before the target is able to use any mitigation, and then records that damage to be reflected to the enemy the next few times that you hit them. To explain this a little bit simpler, it is essentially a little bit over a 10% more overall damage multiplier per maximum impale you are able to inflict on the target. This build also utilizes one of the most powerful damage from defensive items in the game, which is Perseverance. This item is extremely broken on the champion, as it scales particularly well with our Ascendancy that provides aura effect to Determination and Grace, as well as the intended defensive path of combining armor and evasion that the duelist excels in. We also have permanent Fortify on this build, meaning that the belt gives us permanent onslaught. Now, by stacking this immense level of evasion and armor, we are able to get upwards of 800% increased attack damage, as well as solid defensive stats, permanent onslaught like I said before, all from this one little belt while simply scaling defenses as we normally would. And on top of that, the belt isn't even that expensive. Now, in previous versions of this build, we focused on dual wielding and utilized the Savior Sword to essentially double our damage. This, along with Paradoxica, resulted in some pretty serious output. However, there is a small problem with this setup when it comes to Vengeant Cascade. The way that Vengeant Cascade works with our clones is that the projectiles return to them instead of us. And unfortunately, the clones kind of have a mind of their own most of the time. So we're not able to consistently stack them on top of bosses or single target as easily to get that massive overlap that this should be causing. That being said, the Savior in dual wield is still a very solid build choice. You can adjust this build to use the Savior and either Paradoxica or a Belltimber Blade with some very small changes, and on average that setup will be slightly superior and clear. However, we're going to be focusing on using a two-handed sword for this build guide, as it allows us a significantly easier time of creating Crucible trees, provides us with an easier early transition from Terminus Est, which doesn't require the relatively annoying playstyle of Belltimber Blades, and overall has more consistent damage output on single target, while also having a slightly more optimal passive tree. Remember boys, if you enjoy this content or this video ends up helping you out, consider liking this video to help support the channel and subscribing and hitting that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos. This concludes the intro section of this guide. We'll be jumping into game to cover more specifics of the build's gearing, abilities, and more, while also checking out the path of building and explaining how to use the various functions within. So without further ado, let's get into it. This section of the guide is going to get very specific and very granular. There are going to be timestamps and chapters down below so you can jump to any particular portion of the guide. This is specifically for people who would prefer a video guide to a written guide. I'll be going over everything in depth so that you can understand it if that is the way that you learn. The first thing that we're going to be talking about are the skills on this build, and our main skill is Splitting Steel. As you can see, when we use this ability, you'll notice that the projectile fires out and then these projectiles come back to our character. Now if you look, you'll see that most of the time these are overlapping in an area directly in front of us. You can scale this ability with AoE if you would like, because this does make it slightly easier to overlap. However, I have found that in most cases it doesn't really matter that much. And the second part of this ability is going to be Call of Steel. The way that this works is that all of these impales that we've inflicted on this enemy are then ripped out, and you can see at the top left our steel shards are being recharged. This is a good clear ability. Typically, the way that you should play this build is you should kind of get in a rhythm of hitting maybe 4 or 5 times with Splitting Steel, and then immediately ripping those steel shards back out to clear the entire screen. Now, one massive way that we do scale our damage here is going to be with Sniper's Mark, and we scale the effectiveness of this mark to get additional projectiles. As I said previously, Splitting Steel splits the projectiles off of the main projectile. However, with Sniper's Mark, if I can find the gem here, you'll see that it says projectiles which hit cursed enemies split towards 5 additional targets. The idea is this stacks with Splitting Steel, and it causes an additional 5 splits to come out, which go out, hit all of the enemies, and then come back and overlap in that AoE. However, there is a significantly easier way to scale mark effect these days through these nodes here, Expert Hunter and the 2 nodes before it, as well as the implicit on our gloves, and you can also get a helmet enchant if you would like, although that is a much more expensive option. The way that this works is it helps us to scale the effectiveness of this, and because this is level 21, we get 5 additional targets. So for every 20% effectiveness that you scale, you get a whole additional projectile for this ability, which means that at super high gear levels with a lot of investment on top of our other additional projectile that we get over here through multi-shot, we're able to get like 14, 15, 16 projectiles going when we're fighting single target, which is an insane amount of effectiveness of damage. Because if we look at Splitting Steel, you'll notice that the attack damage is 221% of base, and the effectiveness of added damage is 222% of base. And this is only reduced by 35% on split targets, which means that we are scaling an absolutely massive amount of effective damage here. This ability is super busted with Vengeant Cascade, and I highly suspect that Vengeant Cascade is going to be nerfed in next league, so this is the time to jump on this if you ever wanted to play this build. Now beyond that, we do use two separate movement abilities. We have Leap Slam, which just scales effectively with our attack speed, as well as, you know, having a nice pirouette that the duelist does. However, I would say our main movement skill is actually Frostblink, and the reason for this is that a lot of the time when you're playing this game, you'll notice that you get heavily slowed by either like delirium hands or any other debuffs that are happening in the game, like entangling and all kinds of annoying things. However, the thing about Frostblink is that it is one of the only truly instant movement abilities. So while you're in the middle of attacking, you can actually Frostblink and continue attacking at the same time. This is super useful for things like delirium maps where you're getting stuck by the hands that are grasping you. It is really useful for dodging boss abilities while maintaining DPS. And the cool thing about this is that it does reduce the cooldown of the ability if you hit enemies with it. And on top of that, if you get the alt quality of this, it reduces that cooldown even further for rare and unique enemies. So Frostblink is a super useful movement skill. It is absolutely excellent for this build because of it allowing you to reposition yourself and to move quickly through dense packs and delirium maps. I use it probably a lot more than I use Leap Slam. However, Leap Slam is just useful for getting around, especially when you've got like all of your attack speed and frenzy charges going. Now, talking about our defensive abilities, our main one is going to be Molten Shell, and we're going to be using this with a cast when damage taken. Now, we do use Vol Molten Shell. You can't see it because GGG has made an absurdly large ability here, but this is Molten Shell as well as Vol Molten Shell. The cast when damage taken is only proccing our normal Molten Shell, and we have our cast when damage taken set to about a third of our health pool. That's around the proper number that you want to have this actually proc. However, the idea here is that anytime that you do take a relatively large hit of damage, this is going to proc your normal Molten Shell. But in situations where you feel like you're going to take a ton of repetitive hits or you feel like you're very much in danger, you can use the Vol portion of Molten Shell whenever you would like, as long as the cooldown is ready. So this gives us a cast when damage taken whenever we take damage that we're not ready for, as well as a Vol version that we can click whenever we need some like specific damage reduction. Now, earlier versions of the build will be using Enduring Cry. You'll be putting this on your left click with the node on the tree that makes it so that your war cries are instant. That's going to be Call to Arms here. This is something that you can use in later versions of the build that you want. However, the skill tree can't really path over here as effectively. As you can see, it's 1, 2, 3 points, and we don't really take any of these nodes anymore. So it's a little bit inefficient because as we go into the very end game version of the build, we're actually dropping most of these nodes over here anyways. However, in all of the videos and everything that you've seen so far, this isn't even the most end game version of the build, simply because I want to use my currency on further projects going forward. So it's just not really efficient to have this ability in the build for me. It doesn't really feel like I need it. However, in very dense delirium maps, this would be very helpful as it'll give you a little bit more physical damage reduction. Now, talking about our additional buff abilities, we do have Blood Rage. We do scale this pretty effectively with our Enhance, so this gives us a ton of extra quality on it. I should have a level 4 Enhance, but once again, I don't want to spend too much money here on this build. But this gives us 31% attack speed. It causes us to leech some of attack physical damage as life, as well as provides us our source of frenzy charges while we are clearing. On top of this, we are using a Phantasmal Ancestral Protector with MAME support. Now, the idea behind this is that this is the only totem that really works for us because Splitting Steel and all of the steel abilities are not melee abilities. These are ranged abilities that use a melee weapon. So the idea here is that this Ancestral Protector totem simply gives us attack speed. Now, if we're using the alt quality of this, this also increases the effect of our Ancestor totem, which scales very well with Ashes of the Stars, but we'll talk about that later. We also do have this linked to MAME support. This is our only source of MAME. This causes the totem to also, when it hits enemies, to cause us to deal a little bit more damage. Now, I did already kind of talk about Sniper's Mark. However, for clearing in maps, we do use Mark on Hit, as it is simply just way less annoying to have to click the mark every single time when you're trying to move through enemies. However, I would say on very difficult bosses, we're talking like Uber bosses, Pinnacle bosses and such, you should remove this Mark on Hit, as Mark on Hit does give reduced effective marks from supported skills, meaning that you're going to get less projectiles from Sniper's Mark. So simply self-cast Sniper's Mark whenever you are on a very difficult boss, but leave this slotted in whenever you, are clearing maps so that you have a little bit of an easier time. Now, we are a champion, so this is an aura stack build, and you'll notice that we have a ton of them. So our auras that we use are of course going to be Grace as well as Determination. This is to scale our armor as well as our evasion, which are two very popular defensive layers right now, as well as scaling extremely well with Perseverance. We also do use Pride. This is an aura that causes us to deal significantly more physical damage to targets that we are nearby. On top of that, we have Dread Banner. This is one of our main sources of Impale chance. It also does give us Impale effect. And one big thing about Dread Banner is that it does have nearby enemies have less accuracy rating, meaning that you're going to evade more effectively when you are nearby enemies with this. We do use Precision to be able to cap our accuracy, as well as give us a little bit of crit chance. And in later versions of the build, you will use Flesh and Stone. The main use for this is going to be the alt quality in my opinion. However, it is a very nice aura for defensives whenever you are clearing, like in Delirium maps and such. And when you are doing a boss, you can swap it to the Flesh aura, which will cause you to do additional damage. However, most of the time I do stay in Stone Stance because it causes nearby enemies to be blinded, which means that they're going to hit you less frequently and you will take less damage from enemies that are far away. A lot of the time I do even keep this on bosses. So that's going to be it for the skills. Let's jump into Path of Building to talk about the gear and a couple other things. So first thing, there are 3 separate versions of this PoB. There's going to be a budget version, a mid-tier version, as well as an expensive version. I would say that the character that you saw in the highlights is somewhere in between the middle and the expensive version. I haven't gone all the way to the expensive version because I want to save some of my currency for further projects. However, let's start with the budget version so we can talk a little bit about leveling. The budget PoB will have all of the leveling information in it. You can use this from level 1 all the way up to the end of the game. And then as you are ready, or if you enjoy the build enough and you can invest a little bit more into it, you'll jump into the middle tier and then the end tier version of these PoBs. So when we're talking about leveling, you will notice that in the bottom left section here, there are going to be multiple trees that are going to be sorted by the axe that you go through. If you go through these different skill trees, it'll show you step by step where you should be going as you progress and as you level up your character. Notably, do keep in mind that our leveling uses a very powerful combo of precise technique as well as point blank. These, in combination with the leveling ability that we use that is Shattering Steel, cause us to do significant damage while clearing, despite all of the nerfs that happen to early game Splitting Steel and early game Shattering Steel. Now, one thing to be careful with when it comes to precise technique is you do always need to make sure that your accuracy rating is higher than your maximum life. You can get this through swords as you level up will typically have accuracy implicits. There's plenty of accuracy nodes on the tree, as well as the precision aura that you can use. But if you move through these different trees, it'll show you step by step which points you should be putting in as you go through the different acts. It will also show you down in the bottom which ascendancy points that you should be speccing at which times. Notably, the second and third ascendancy nodes are gotten at the same time later on, because this first ascendancy point that we get, Unstoppable Hero, is not really useful until you have the third one, which is Fortitude. I do suggest that you get these two first, as they will make you significantly tankier and enable you to use the belt later. However, the fourth ascendancy Inspirational is very important later on, so do make sure that you get it. Now, beyond that, you will notice that there are a few separate swaps that will happen throughout the transition here. The first one is going to be a swap to crit. Notably, this precise technique keystone is going to prevent you from dealing critical strikes, and with Terminus Est having such a huge crit strike chance, this really does affect our damage early on, so we should be dropping this and moving towards a more crit-based setup. That is what this transition is going to be focused on. After that, as you move into like red maps or maybe late yellow maps, you are going to want to start stacking spell suppression, and this is the point where you will do that. Notably, you should take as much spell suppression as you can on the tree and forfeit damage so that you can maintain 100% as easily as possible. Now, very early on when you are making this transition, you can use the mastery that causes your chance to suppress spell damage to be lucky until you are able to fully cap that, but you really should focus on capping spell suppression as early as you possibly can. And then beyond that, you'll have the endgame tree. This is going to take you all the way up to level 95, and from here, this is where I would say with these items, this tree, all of the items that you see here, this is probably where you should decide whether or not you want to continue playing the build and then jump into the later PoBs. Now, finishing up the leveling section, there are a specific set of leveling skills that you can see here, but this shows you the skills that you should be using as you level up, as well as the ones that you'll use all the way through the campaign. We do also have some items here that you can use while leveling. These are just the things that I suggest that you use while leveling up if you are making like a second or third character for your league and you want something that has a little bit more oomph. These can carry you most of the way through the game, and most of the time Thief's Torment carries me all the way up until maps. But beyond that, this is the first budget set of gear. This should not cost you any more than around 1 divine for all of this. These items are relatively easy to get. There's nothing crazy here. Terminus Est is a 1 chaos sword. Get as good of a crucible tree as you can. You can spend a little bit more money on this sword to get a good crucible tree because it will make it substantially better. But the items here are life, as much spell suppression as you can get, and just resistance stats. That's all that's on these pieces of gear. After you find halfway decent items, apply the Eldritch Implicit Orbs. The lowest tier ones are used here, and they should be relatively inexpensive, but they are pretty important, so make sure that you apply them to your gear as you level up. Now, there are a bunch of alternative items that you'll find in some of these slots that you can use, so check those out if you can't get a hold of some of the ones that are listed here. However, that is going to be mostly it for the leveling. As I said before, in the notes section all the way down here at the bottom, there will be more information about leveling. Make sure to check this if you're having any issues. Now, moving on to the mid-tier PoB, this is going to be where I would say that you will probably want to land if you really want to try this build. I don't think that you ever need any more gear than what is in this middle PoB if all you're planning on doing is doing some easy pinnacle bosses, non-Ubers, although I did do a few Ubers with this level of gear, as well as maybe farming some Delirium maps and some good high-end content. This version of the build will probably cost you around 10 to 20 divines depending on how much you want to invest into it, and it should be able to accomplish most things in the game. Remember that in Path of Exile these days you really do need to invest into your build to make them powerful, to make them worthwhile. You really can't do all of the content in the game anymore for like less than 1 divine. It just isn't really the way that things work. You do want to spend effort, spend money, and spend time. Now, that first budget PoB should get you most of the way through farming some tier 16 maps with whatever you'd like to do on the Atlas passive tree. However, once you have upgraded to these items with that currency, I would say that this is around the time that you should be thinking about farming some like Delirium orb maps with maybe like Legion, Abyss, and Breach and all that kind of stuff. I'll make a video soon that will talk about my specific Atlas farming strategy that I used with this build, so look forward to that in most likely a couple of days. But once we have moved to the secondary skill tree, you'll notice that things have changed a little bit. We've cut most of the things off on the bottom left section here and have moved a little bit more to the top right, as well as slotting in some cluster jewels, mainly so that we can have some extra jewel slots. So let's talk a little bit about the gear that we're going to be using here. One of the biggest upgrades that you can make when you jump into the middle section of this build is going to be the crafted sword. This is relatively straightforward to make, and in the notes section there are full crafting notes, actually I'll just show them to you right now, that go over each and every different sword, every different item that you can make, all the different options that you have for unique items. But do note that the gearing section is slightly different depending on which version of the build that you're in. Like the very expensive version of the build is only going to be talking about the crafted rares that you would use in the super expensive version. This is going to have the more simpler version that's gonna maybe cost you 10 to 20 divines depending on how much you want to invest into it. It's got all of the information about all the gear that you could possibly want to make. However, as I said, this sword is relatively straightforward to create. You essentially just get a fractured physical damage Ezomite blade, meaning either the normal physical roll or the hybrid physical roll, and then you're going to be hitting this with the added physical damage essences until you get the other physical damage roll. Once you've got that, you can just prefixes cannot be changed, scour all the suffixes, and then multi-mod, and you've got a sword that'll carry you all the way through the game, even through the Ubers. It's not very difficult to make. It should only cost you a couple of divines. With average luck, you might get super unlucky with those essences, but this is a very, very powerful sword for almost nothing. Beyond that, we're once again just using some relatively simple essence crafted gear. This is going to be just essence crafted rares that you apply as good of Eldritch Implicits that you can to. That's going to be all of the gear here. There is nothing super special about this. It is all just essence crafted. There's no like big giant Awakener influence items or anything like that, just very simple gear. We are using Fury Valve. I know that recently the price of this has gone up pretty significantly. However, it is a very, very good amulet. I would say that this is probably the best of the amulets before you swap over to Ashes. However, you can once again use the Eternal Struggle if you can get a good one, but either of them are fine. For the rings, I would focus on Chaos Resist here. This is one of the few slots that you can get guaranteed Chaos Resist in. You can also just get whatever modifier fractured on these that you like, either like a resistance that you need or like a stat like intelligence or strength that you need, and then use essences once again to craft these. We're going to be using Perseverance pretty much the entire time that you're playing this build. It's super powerful. It's really cheap. You can get good corruptions on it pretty easily. Just an overall super powerful item. Talking about the flasks, you do want to try to make sure that you use these specific flasks. However, there are notes on which flasks you can use down further in the gearing section, so make sure to check that out. And when we're talking about the jewels in particular, I would say the Watcher's Eye is one of the more important ones, because this does make it so that those impales I talked about earlier will last additional hits while using Pride. However, keep in mind you can only use this when you transition to the middle tier version of the build, because this is when you're going to be able to use Pride, as the early version of the build is using Purity of Elements to be able to maintain elemental ailment avoidance. On On the mid-tier version of the build, we are using boots as well as a chest piece and the stats that we get on the tree to be able to get that 100% elemental ailment avoidance. Beyond that, we do use a large cluster jewel. This is going to be a physical damage cluster jewel. These are very cheap as they are super easy to craft with harvest, but we're just looking for some physical damage, some armor and evasion and physical damage, as well as some attack and cast speed. Now you can swap this out for the double damage one, however, more attack speed typically makes the build feel a little better. Beyond that, we are using an impossible escape around perfect agony. Now note that most likely as this build guide goes live, the price of this will skyrocket quite a bit. There's nothing that I can do about this, but this is the best one for the build in my opinion. You also can use the one around conduit if you would like, but if this item is simply too expensive because of this build guide or because of anything else, you can simply take other points on the tree. There are a ton of points down here that are super useful. There's things like the projectile damage here, you can get more aura nodes, you can get more life, you can get pretty much anything that you would like, and then simply just replace that jewel slot with a good rare jewel. Now one of the biggest damage bonuses that you're going to be able to get on this build is going to be a good brutal restraint. You can use the find timeless jewel section down here. You'll just go to brutal restraint, you'll do conquer any because we're not taking any of these nodes, and you will choose either the wind dancer socket or the duelist socket. Both of these have pretty good coverage for nodes that we take, but what you're going to do is you're going to search for the aura effect here. You're going to want to get as many of these as you can on the jewel. Now keep in mind there are ones that have like 4 or 5, but these are going to be extremely rare and highly sought after. You can settle for 2 aura effect nodes and just some other good nodes. There are a ton of these that have 3 that you should be able to get, so just look for one that has 2 or 3 and some other decent nodes on them. Don't go crazy here until you're ready to really invest because these can get absurdly expensive. Now, beyond that, we are using a Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame. In the budget version of the build, we're using Outmatch and Outlast simply because this is the cheapest but most effective one that you can get when it comes to these. If you cannot get any Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame for some reason, just simply use 2 more rare jewels. Honestly, it'll probably make you a little bit tankier and it'll be somewhat similar damage to Outmatch and Outlast. Later on in the more expensive version, I'll talk about some of the alternative options that you can get, but that is the majority of the gear for the middle tier version of the build. Now, moving on to the expensive version, this is going to be for people who really want to farm up some ubers and want to do a lot of damage and invest a ton of money. This is the one that's going to get you all the way up to that 100+ million DPS, but keep in mind, that's with initial Pride effect, as well as none of the flasks turned on. With all of that turned on, we're doing closer to 175 million, so do keep that in mind. This build can get some pretty massive damage when you're really just standing on top of something and dealing some damage to it. Now, here with the gear, there are some differences. Notably, this uses a better crafted sword, meaning that you're going to have just a higher physical damage roll, but that's the only difference between this sword and the previous ones. We also have put the Heist implicit modifier on here that's going to give you increased explicit physical modifiers as well as speed modifiers. So we're just being a little bit more picky with the sword that we've crafted here. The process is exactly the same though. As well as the rest of the gear, we are using higher versions of the Eldritch implicits, as well as being slightly more picky with the mods that are on these pieces of gear, doing things such as like using veiled chaos orbs and like suffixes and prefixes can't be changed, making these items just a little bit better, focusing more on improving them. Same goes with everything here, as you'll see throughout the items. Talking about Ashes of the Stars, this is a very extremely powerful item for this build because we use a ton of alt effects. And notably, with Splitting Steel, the effectiveness of the default quality is actually really powerful. Increased Impale effect is super strong for this build. But you'll see things like Divergent Determination, which scales us a whole bunch of extra armor off of our evasion rating, Anomalous Precision, Anomalous Flesh and Stone. We've got things like our Sniper's Mark scales very well with this, our Banner scales very well with this. If we take Anomalous, this is like 6% less damage taken from nearby enemies or something like that. Our Leap Slam, we can drop faster attacks because we'll be able to swap to Phantasmal. And then on our Ancestral Protector and our Blood Rage, this gives us a ton of extra damage with Phantasmal, as well as the default attack speed that we get here. So this item is super powerful. It gives us a ton of damage, a ton of defenses, just a ton of very, very good stats. And it does give us a bunch of increased reservation efficiency of skills as well, allowing us to drop some nodes on the tree that you've seen here. We dropped all of these reserve nodes over here while still running a bunch of auras. With the rings, you're just going to be a little bit more careful, a little bit more strict with the mods that you want on them. We're once again using Perseverance. And in the final version of the build, we're using the best versions of the flasks that we can get with all high tier rolled mods, 3 charges when you're hit by an enemy, and high tiers of the suffixes. Now, the jewels are mostly the same, except there are 2 versions of this final in-game tree. We are using 2 large cluster jewels here because we simply want to have more room for jewel slots. As we do scale up these rare jewels, the more that you invest into them, the more powerful they get. So these are very, very good jewels that get you a ton of crit multi, and this is just a significant amount of damage from the second cluster jewel. However, there is another option that you can do here, and this is going to be if you want the Impale Mastery later on in the game. Now, notably for me, when it comes to bossing, the Impale Mastery is not that important, but Call of Steel does feel a little bad sometimes to be used pack to pack. So if you really do want that Impale Mastery in the late version of the build, you will have to drop one of these clusters and go for this Impale Mastery, as well as you can get a little bit of crit and blind here. These trees are relatively similar, but I do feel that the 2 jewel one is going to be a significant more damage. However, the playstyle might feel slightly worse. Beyond that, we are going to be using Headsman now. This is a significantly more expensive set of jewels. You can use Arena Challenger. This is very, very expensive, but other options would be things like Bane of Legends is perfectly fine, Headsman as I said before, or First to Strike Last to Fall. Notably, you can get Fortitude, Master of Metal, or Inspirational instead of First to Strike Last to Fall, as you can just slot whichever one you weren't able to get. So that is going to be it for gearing the character. We've talked about the budget, the mid, and the high tier of gear, so I want to talk a little bit more broadly about the way that this build scales damage, as well as the way that this build scales defenses. So starting with the offenses, this build is an Impale build, so we do want to scale as many Impales as we can. The Master of Metal notable here does give you 1 additional Impale, as well as added physical damage for each Impale on the enemy, and then we are using the Watcher's Eye with Impale's last 2 additional hits with Pride, so this is extremely powerful. But beyond that, of course, we do have Perseverance, which you notice that we lose 34% of our overall damage if we take this belt off. This is a lot of damage that we lose by just this 1 belt if we didn't use it. This allows us to scale some of our defenses into offenses. This is a super powerful belt. It's used on most attack damage champions. You should use it. Really cheap, very, very powerful. Beyond that, we are a crit build, so one of the best ways to scale damage at super high gear levels when you can invest lots of money is going to be crit, because crit multi is just going to multiply the amount of damage you do significantly, and swords work very well with crit because there's a lot of nodes on the tree that help you scale your crit chance with swords. So when we do have our diamond flask active and all of our other flasks, we're at about 90% crit chance. You can get this higher if you do have a better crit roll on your sword, so do keep that in mind. Just kind of adjust it for whatever your needs might be. Getting as much crit multi and as much crit chance as you possibly can is super important to the build. Also, don't skimp on hit chance ever. Make sure that this number is always 100% in PoB. You can do this through stacking accuracy here, the level of your precision gem, try to go for like level 21 if you can, as well as blind also does work very well for hit chance. It does reduce the evasion of the enemy monster, so keep that in mind. But beyond that, we scale the damage in relatively normal ways of just having a bigger base from our sword, as well as scaling some added damage, extra jewels, extra gems, all that kind of good stuff. Now, talking about defenses, there are 3 separate forms of defenses that I think are important in any build. One is going to be reducing the amount of damage that you take. This is super important for actually not dying to like boss hits or enemy hits and such. We're getting this through things like armor and less damage done by enemies from like our alt quality on our banner. We get this from resistances, just things that reduce the raw amount of damage that we take. Things like spell suppression, all of those good things. However, on top of that, you do need a source of avoiding damage to make builds feel good these days. The main way that we're doing this is through evasion. You'll notice that we have 93% chance to evade attacks, meaning that most of the attacks that are coming through to us are actually not hitting. So the idea here is that when we do get hit, we don't take very much damage, and we don't get hit very often. This is scaled even higher when we do have our flasks on, so we get up to 94% evasion as well as 90% physical damage reduction. We've got 75 of all elemental resists, as well as a decent amount of chaos resist. This all combined means that we don't get hit very often, and when we do get hit, it isn't super hard. Now, these are not the only defensive layers. One of the biggest defensive layers that I think most people overlook is going to be actually recovering your health bar. This, in my opinion, is the most important defensive layer for making a build actually feel good. The way that we're going to be getting this is in 2 separate ways. There's going to be Leech, which I think is the most effective way 90% of the time, and then there is going to be life gain on hit. So first off, we are going to be using Volpact. This does completely turn off your regen. However, the build didn't have very much regen to begin with, so I think that this node is very powerful. We are also using the new Leech Mastery that does make some of your leech instant. This is super strong, and you notice the difference immediately. We are leeching up to 2,300 life per second, which is around half of our total health. So every second you're getting half of your health back. Now, there are situations where leech is actually not that effective, and the main one is going to be in delirium maps. So what you're going to do in delirium maps is you're going to unspec these 3 points here, leaving the mana leech because we do need this to cast our skills, and you are going to be coming over to here and grabbing these 3 nodes, this life gain on hit nodes. We hit super frequently. So the idea here is that on delirium mobs, because they have so much damage reduction, it's really hard to get effective amounts of leech going. So when we're attacking delirium mobs, this life gain on hit just scales with the amount of times that we're hitting the enemy. So this, as you can see, is less effective when it comes to the actual rate that you're doing it, but it isn't affected by doing less damage. So this is very powerful. If you are doing like high-end delirium maps or simulacrum, I do suggest that you swap over to these nodes, but in general, especially on bosses, leech and instant leech is just simply going to feel better. Now, I will talk a little bit about the configuration here. Notably, you'll notice in the bottom section here that I have a bunch of elemental resistances, chaos resistance, and stats. This is because there is no reasonable way for me to tell you where to get these stats on all of your gear. You just need to find room for it. There is plenty of room. My character in game has very similar gear, and it has absolutely no problem with stats and resistances. You can get them on your helmet, your body armor, your gloves, your boots, your rings. There's plenty of room here. Also, in the notes section here, there's going to be this section here that'll tell you where you can obtain these different stats that you need and what you should be looking for at any given time. If you have questions, go to this section. However, beyond that, this is set up to be worst case scenario most of the time when you're fighting, say, a boss. The pride effect is on initial effect, meaning that this is just as soon as you've jumped in. We do always have frenzy charges. We're going to gain these super easily on single target through our mastery here, the mark mastery. We hit like, I don't know, 20 or 30 times a second or something like that. This will always give you frenzy charges. You don't have to worry about it. You will always have them. We have life tap from using our abilities. We have perma onslaught from our belt, perma fortify from our ascendancy. We have crit recently. We've got 90% chance to crit, and we hit like 30 times a second. You'll always be critting. We do have 4 nearby enemies here. This is mainly for just clearing. This is because of our major god, Soul of Lunaris. You could turn this to 1 if you wanted to see how much damage that you would be able to take on bosses. I leave it at 4 because that's like an average middle section for just randomly clearing stuff. I have not put in killed a rare or unique enemy. This would boost the damage by a decent amount because of our passive that we get from Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame. And of course, we've impaled. We are maiming through our totem. We are intimidating through our glove enchant, and we are crushing through Awakened Brutality. This is set to a Guardian Pinnacle boss. If you look at the damage down here, we're doing 100 million. If we go to a Uber Pinnacle boss, we're doing about 30 million without Pride stacked and without our flasks. So we are doing plenty of damage to being able to kill an Uber boss effectively. Now, last but definitely not least, I do want to talk about these notes. I've spent a ton of time. The note sections are slightly different for each version of the PoB, as they'll have different information that you need at different steps, but there is a lot of information in here. The vast majority of questions that you could possibly have will be answered in these notes, so do check them out. We'll quickly go through them. These are going to be all of the stats that I think that you should be maintaining. If the build is feeling weird or something feels off, go to this and double check that you're doing every single thing in this list. This is like the quick, okay, am I doing this? Am I doing that? Am I doing this? If you check all of these things, you should be mostly good. Beyond that, we do have some frequently asked questions that answer, like if you have a basic question that maybe you just don't really have the answer to. There's a bunch of stuff talked about in here, particularly this thing about Awakened Fork. If you want very good clear later on, check out that section. Each individual guide is going to have a different gearing section for all of the pieces. These should be sequential, and you should be able to upgrade your items from previous to the new ones as you go through. So check out all of these guides. It'll tell you like what kind of Crucible trees you're looking for, how to craft the items, what implicits that you should be going on, what enchants you should be looking for, all of that good stuff through here. On top of that, I do talk about flasks and which flask mods you should use. You can very easily roll your own flasks. It's not hard at all these days. I have gotten more alteration orbs this league than I've ever had before. You should be able to do it. We talk about the jewels, the different mods that you can look for on a Watcher's Eye, the different Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame jewels that you can choose, how to go about getting the timeless jewels, all that kind of good stuff. We've got information about the leveling, and pretty much anything you could ever need is in these notes. Now, that being said, if all of this has not been able to help you and you do need additional help, on my Discord there is a specific channel meant for this build. Please keep all of your questions and all of the talk about this particular build to that channel and to that thread, as my Discord is just meant to be a place for people to hang out and chill and talk about Path of Exile and other ARPGs and whatever else they want to talk about. So please, I'm begging you, don't pollute the rest of the channels with questions about this build. It kind of upsets most of the general community. Keep it to that thread. I've made it specifically for that reason. If for some reason you can't get the question answered in the Discord, you can't get the question answered from this guide, come and check out my Twitch stream at twitch.tv/bigducks. Whenever I'm live, I'm happy to answer questions to the best of my ability. Beyond that, if you really feel like you need personal one-on-one help, I do have tiers available in my Patreon that do get you time spent with me, but understand that I do value my time highly. So if you really, for some reason, cannot figure it out from this, you can go subscribe to higher tiers in my Patreon, and I will be happy to answer questions in that regard. Remember that patrons also do get early access to these POBs, as well as some other bonus content. And that is going to be it for the video. Remember, boys, if you enjoyed this video or it ended up helping you out, make sure to give it a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in Ray Class. And I'll see you guys in the next video.